The ontological argument is one of the most debated and well-respected arguments in support of the existence of God. However, for me personally, it never sounded convincing, and from the first time I heard it up until now, I still have the same basic objection, which never seems to be solved by any response I have ever been given. Before getting into this, let me specify that in this video I am only addressing the original ontological argument by Saint Anselm, and not any newer variations like the model ontological argument. I am aware that many contemporary philosophers like Alvin Plantinga have come up with new, different ontological arguments that may be better than the Anselmian one, but today I want to focus on Anselm. So without further ado, the Anselmian ontological argument goes something like this. God is defined as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. A thing that exists as a concept in the mind and in reality, all things being equal, is greater than the thing that exists only as an idea in the mind. If God exists only as a concept in the mind, then we can imagine something that is greater than God, that is, a thing that is also in reality. We cannot imagine something that is greater than God, because He is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Therefore, God exists both as a concept in the mind and in reality. In my experience, there is two kinds of reactions that people have when first hearing this argument. The first is that it sounds like a very logical and convincing proposition, and the second is that it is complete nonsense, although for some reason it is very difficult to explain why it's nonsense. Personally, that's the way I felt, and I think I can finally explain why. See, if you look carefully, Anselm's ontological argument is not really an argument at all. In fact, I'm going to show you that the premises and the conclusion are parts of completely different propositions that are mixed together, and that therefore the conclusion cannot be said to follow from the premises alone. The problem begins already with just the first four words of the first premise. God is defined as. When I start a statement by saying that a thing is defined as, then obviously everything that follows in that sentence is explaining a definition. When I say chairs are defined as, the thing that comes after these words is just the content of the definition of chairs. For all I know, however, it does not tell me anything about whether chairs are real or not. I could very easily build the same sentence while talking about the Philosopher's Stone in Harry Potter. I could say, the Philosopher's Stone in Harry Potter is defined as, and then make a perfectly coherent statement about what the stone is defined as. But obviously the definition of the Philosopher's Stone tells us nothing about its existence, unless we want to specify from the beginning that it is a fictional creation and should be treated as such. Now let's look at Anselm's argument again. If you notice, every single word of every single premise in the argument falls under the casket of these first four words. All of the quote-unquote premises either tell us about what God is defined as, or about what the words that God is defined as mean. The first premise straight up gives us the definition. The second premise simply shows us the consequence of what it would mean for something to be the greatest conceivable thing. It tells us that if something is to be the greatest thing, then it has to be in reality. Again though, let's not forget that this does not give us any reason to believe in God. It only explains what the definition of God would mean. It only talks about the definition of God, not about God himself. And we could rephrase the second premise to simply state that greatness as a quality is defined as such that if something were to exist, it would be greater than something identical to it that would only exist as a concept in the mind. This restating of the premise loses nothing from the meaning of the original premise, and it only highlights the fact that it is talking about a definition and not about God himself. So the first premise defines the concept of God. The second defines and further explains the concept of greatness. The third and fourth premises show us how if the definition of God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, then that definition would have been referring to an existing entity. But of course, we're still just talking about what the definition of God is. Sure, God is defined as something real. What a revelation! I mean, of course he is defined as something real. Everything is defined as something that exists, unless we are trying to deliberately exclude it from real things. Imagine if I told you that I defined God as a fictional concept. Well, then there would be no point in trying to find reasons to believe in God, because there would be no point in trying to find something that is defined as fictional. Whenever we want to test whether something exists, we have to define it as something that at least would be real if it existed. If we define it from the first place to not be real, then there would be no point in searching for it. And that's why the definition of God cannot give us any account of whether he exists. It can only give us an account of what the definition is referring to. It can only tell us what it would be for him to be if he existed. So basically, if we were to define God as something that is fictional, then what we would be saying is the following. If what we are referring to as God existed, it would exist as a fictional concept. In contrast, if we define God as something real, what we are saying is that if what we are referring to as God exists, it exists in reality. And that is exactly what the premises of Anselm's ontological argument do. They explain that God's definition is that of an existing thing. Therefore, if it exists in reality. What Anselm does, however, is that he removes that if. He explains the definition of God and then says, therefore God exists, which is completely nonsensical. The conclusion of his argument should be that, therefore, God's definition is that of something that exists. Because that's clearly what the premises are supporting. The question of whether the thing that this definition is referring to actually exists is a question that needs premises that are not about the definition of the thing, but about the thing itself. And this is why I believe that Anselm's ontological argument fails miserably. And to conclude my argument, let me condense Anselm's argument into two basic lines. 1. God is defined as something that exists. 2. Therefore God exists. If we look at the argument like this, it becomes extremely clear that the conclusion has nothing to do with the premise. And I'd know that at first glance it may sound like I'm committing the strawman fallacy, but I think that if you really look into the premises of the Anselmian argument, they really just condense into that first premise. God is defined as something that exists. And just as a matter of reasoning, we cannot simply define things into existence. If you disagree with me, feel free to comment below and tell me your opinion.